change is constant, it's inevitable, but do you think we're in sort of a period here, Andy, now of greater change than ever before? And what are the factors you think are driving that?
Change is a bit like, have you heard of the boiling frog syndrome? Everybody nod their head, yeah? So you drop a frog into a pot of boiling water, it'll jump straight out. If you put it into a cool pot of water and start to heat it up, it will never get out, and by the time it thinks that water's too hot, it's too late. And I think change is a bit like that in the marketplace. You don't recognize it until it just punches you in the face, right? And by which time it's probably too late. But if you think about the kind of top-down view of what's changing in our marketplace and what's causing that change, I think it's quite helpful, even at the macro level, to try and understand why that's happening and what that means for your business. So the first thing that we hear a lot about innovation at the moment, and the government is behind this whole program around innovation. What's driving that is not necessarily the need to because it's nice to innovate. It's because around the world, if you look at most markets and most large organizations, there is almost no growth. And if there's almost no growth, there's almost no incremental shareholder value, and share prices just haven't moved. So that money needs to go somewhere. The investment money needs to go somewhere else where it's going to provide a return. So more and more, the mature businesses are looking for organic new growth that will create incremental value for their shareholders. So the first thing to notice in the marketplace is we have anemic growth in most Western markets, and that is driving a need to create change in businesses and business models so that we can start to see an acceleration in growth. The second big shift, and we notice it probably here more than in most other Western markets, is the rise of China and the Asian century, as it's called. It's an absolute juggernaut that is changing. In this country, property markets, it's changing stock markets, it's changing customer preferences, it's having an absolute dramatic effect on technology businesses as well. I don't know if you, hands up who's got WeChat on their phone. Okay, if we were in Shanghai, everybody would have WeChat on their phone. In fact, they have 1.4 billion customers of WeChat, and WeChat is Uber plus eBay plus Menulog plus Tinder plus a currency, all wrapped into a single app. It has 600 million users a month. It absolutely dwarfs Facebook in terms of its size and its growth. Applications like that, new technologies like that we've hardly ever heard of, are absolutely going to change the nature of the businesses that we thought had grown and become static, like a Facebook or a Twitter or a LinkedIn. So that's having a dramatic effect as well. So Asia is the second big shift, and we need to get good and get better and understand what that means for this market and for our businesses and our economy. Thirdly, is technology itself. It's reduced the cost of entry into many, many markets. Who's taken an Uber? Pretty much everyone, right? So for the last 15 years, the taxi cab charge has been the dominant player in the taxi cab market. The margins they make is a 15% levy on top of your cab charge. So 15% has been the standard in the marketplace. Cab charge now are around 5%. So 2/3 of their revenue disappeared in 18 months since Uber arrived. So the disruption, and Uber owns no cabs, no infrastructure, it's just a software business, and it doesn't even actually exist here. Okay, they've got some staff here now, but it really doesn't exist here. It's an American organization. So the cost of entry into the cab market is pretty much zero in this economy, yet they've eaten or destroyed 2/3 of the value of what the incumbent player had. So the disruptive nature of technology is not to be underestimated, and so we need to understand that as a force for change too. And then finally, we've got society itself. We have the fastest growing population cohort in this country is the over 65s. They are growing at a rapid rate. I live on the northern beaches. All of the population growth on the northern beaches is retirees. All of the new building going on the northern beaches, or most of it, is retiree buildings and aged care facilities. That's a massive change in our society too. We're used to, looking at the young people, and those are the target audiences of the large marketers. But that's going to change. Healthcare is a big booming business, and retiree villages are big booming businesses. So we've got some fundamental changes that just haven't. The confluence of those we haven't had before in our society, in any kind of Western society. So it's quite dramatic, and I think it's important for us to recognise what that means for us, and what that means for our careers, and what that means for the way that we live, and what that means for business.
And it's sort of interesting talking about technology there. We've got a few slides which sort of come up to illustrate various points as we go, but one of the slides sort of has that list of companies who've just disappeared from the face of the earth in the last sort of 15 years or so. And one name that stood out today, and bearing in mind we're talking here on a day that Apple launched their new gadgets and what have you, is Nokia, who were the Apple of their time. So I guess that shows that even cutting-edge tech players, you're not immune to this disruption and this change. I mean, with someone like Nokia, what fundamentally went wrong with them, do you think, to sort of wipe them off the planet?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So about 10 years ago, Nokia had 38% of the global handset market for telephones. 38% of all phones. Today, it's close to zero. In fact, they luckily sold to Microsoft, who've more or less closed them down. Now, there's still a few Nokia phones are knocking around, but not many, right? In large degree, they were an early mover in the smartphone market, and I don't know if any of you might remember the phone that flipped up and there was a keyboard underneath it. It was a disaster. It was kind of before its time, but today we're using all of the functionality that phone had. But the argument goes they completely missed the design principles around that piece of technology and how people wanted to interact with it, and missed the smartphone opportunity that BlackBerry picked up and then Apple picked up after them. So Nokia really doesn't exist. Polaroid, Kodak, Netscape. I mean, we use Kodak as a reference point now for disruption, that Kodak had their Kodak moment. Most people don't realize Kodak actually had the patent for Instagram. They actually had invented the software and the internet interface for people to load and post their photos. They just didn't do anything with it, because they thought that people want to print their photos out. Dramatic, right? Now, it's a business that really doesn't exist. Pan Am, MySpace, etc. But here's also what's interesting, is that these companies had exactly the same inflection point, what I call the oh fuck moment, where they realized that their core business was dying. When Lou Gerstner took over IBM in the late 80s, he was facing a business hemorrhaging cash and facing bankruptcy within 3 years, the world's largest IT provider. Apple, post Jobs leaving the first time around, nearly went under. Netflix was, I lived in the States for 11 years. Netflix used to deliver DVDs. And at one point, they actually spun off a business called QuickFlix, which nearly took them under before streaming video came along. And now they are the success story they are. General Motors went to Washington with its hand out for a $10 billion bailout about 10 years ago. It was quite dramatic. All of those businesses have turned around. So what did they learn that the others didn't? I think that's kind of what we wanted to talk about here, was this idea of bell curves and S-curves.
Yes, yeah, I was going to move on to the curve. I think we have another handy graph to sort of illustrate the curve, and maybe a good way to introduce it would be for you to sort of talk through it and actually what it represents.
Yeah. So I have this theory that the way that most people live their lives and the way that most businesses run is a bit like this. This is called a bell curve, right? And actually there's two bell curves there. So what happens is, you start a business, and I've seen it so many times. You start a business, it takes a little while to gather momentum, and then you start to feel this momentum coming, and you've got clients, you've got work, you seem to be popular. Then you have this rapid period of growth. And I hear so much we all hear those wonderful success stories of tech companies that started with 3 people in a basement and a garage, and suddenly there are 150 people and the thing's rocketing and taking off. And then what starts to happen is other people think, now that's a pretty good idea, and other competitors come along and they've got a similar kind of business, kind of business model. Maybe they're a little bit better. Suddenly you're finding yourself not winning every single piece of business that you go for, but every second piece of business or every third piece of business. It starts to become a little bit more difficult. Margins get tight. Maybe you have to lay a few people off. I've certainly had that in my career, in my experience. And then the business starts to lose. You have a bad month, and then you have a couple of bad months, and then you have a good month, and you think it's just an anomaly. But actually what's happening is the business is beginning to die. And you scale back. We'll take people out of the business, we'll rethink the offer slightly, we'll change our pricing structure, maybe we'll hire fewer people, and we'll go again. And what happens is you get to that bottom of that curve, and we have a period of reinvention. Except it's not really a reinvention, it's the same thing done over and over again. And I've seen too many examples of businesses that go through that cycle of growth, plateau, failure to recognize its failure, and then just go again. She'll be right, mate. Too many businesses do that. I came from Telstra. There's a reality to most products and most services that they have a life cycle, that they do commoditize. Everything does. 30 years ago, the majority of Telstra's revenue was earned by fixed voice, home phones. Hands up who's used a home phone in the last year. I can count on one hand. I actually got rid of mine, even though we pay for it. My wife said we don't need it, we don't use it, it's only telemarketers who ever call it, or your dad, and I don't want to talk to him. So we got rid of it. I want to talk to him, she doesn't want to talk to him. But today, the currency for a company like Telstra or Vodafone or Optus is mobile data. But even mobile data is beginning to commoditize. So there is this life cycle to most products, and we need to recognize that happens. And when that happens, and it happens in your own business, it doesn't matter what it is, then you have to start to think about, well, what is going to replace that revenue? What's the new product? What's the next iteration? What's the next new thing that's going to differentiate, earn us differentiated margins, and help us grow? So the challenge is to turn this idea, this continuous, ongoing bell curve of repeated mistakes, if you like, into something a bit more like this, which is what's otherwise known as an S-curve, right? That you get to the top of the cycle and you begin to recognize the signs that your business or your life is plateauing, and you make a change. Now, the interesting thing is that we don't like change. But in order to grow, we have to change. We have to change our products, our services, our business models, the way we behave, the way we charge, everything that is to do with who we are and what made us successful in the first place. My previous boss, David Thodey, said, what got us here won't get us there. So there's this, it's not very well illustrated on this chart, but at that top of that cycle, there's a leap of faith to the next business cycle, to the next curve. And you've got to be prepared to make that leap, and that's where the risk is. So I guess my kind of main message here is I've seen a lot of this happen. What does it take to make that leap? How do you recognize the symbols and signs that things are changing for you and that you need to make the leap to the next S-curve?
That's a very good question to get on to. What are, with all these things, I guess there's some fairly obvious signs that maybe things aren't going as well as they were. But, if you're looking at your business, how important is it to actually keep tabs on where you are on this curve? And how do you actually sort of go about that? Is it something that is obviously quantifiable through sort of revenues and cash flow? Because as you pointed out, it's inevitable. There's a point at which you're going to stagnate to a bit. And at what point do you actually think, are we stagnating because we've reached peak of this offer and it's all downhill from here, or do we just need to tweak this offer in order to carry on growing? Do we need more staff? Do we need bigger office? That kind of thing. So how do you sort of tell apart those kind of signs? What do you look for?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Alex. I think that Andy Grove had this expression that only the paranoid survive, right? And that's not because he was deeply insecure. It's because there's a recognition that everything is changing all of the time. We're, as human beings, resistant to that change. We don't like it. It's natural. We like habits. We like to do the same thing over and over again. But you have to kind of consciously make yourself uncomfortable, and you have to consciously make yourself look for the signs of change in your market. They're not always obvious. They're generally on the periphery. I was running a company called Interbrand in New York, and we were finding that identity was becoming quite commonplace, and brand design was becoming something that anybody could do, and lots of individuals were doing it. And we found lots of little startups, lots of creative directors who had come out of a big agency, starting their own small agencies, were doing exactly the same as what we were doing, and for a third of the price. And okay, the brand can carry you for a bit, but after a while, you realize that the clients there was no risk to them buying a similar service from somebody who used to do it for a big organization for a third of the price. So you had to start to think about, maybe that part of the business, the thing that we felt was most differentiating about us, is actually becoming a commodity. And if that's the case, then we better find the next curve. We better find the next thing that's going to differentiate us. For us, it was digital. It was about, if most people's interaction with a brand is going to be online, then your identity better move. It better be digital. It better be built for that environment rather than built for a static 2D environment. So we began to build a digital capability. We didn't really know what we were doing at the time, but it was at the beginning of that kind of internet era. So I think it's about being paranoid enough to recognize the signs of failure in your own business before they become failings, if that makes sense. And in order to do that, you can't just drink your own Kool-Aid. You can't think that she'll be right, mate. You can't think that we're different. It's okay for us. We're still growing. We've won that piece of business. We've won the last 3 pitches in a row, so everything's fine. You can't think like that. You've got to actually step out of the business, have one foot out of the business. I draw this circle, if that's the business, I need to stand half in and half out. Because if I stand all the way in, then I've become this sort of corporate animal. I've become this believer that nothing can possibly go wrong. Whereas if I stand halfway out, I can look at the rest of the market and try and understand the signals and recognize the signals and listen for the signals of what's really going on in the marketplace and how people are changing and how their demand patterns are changing and how their preferences are changing and how they're buying new products. Netflix is a really great example of that. The cable TV companies in the States said, people want the surety of all of the channels in all of the colors and all of the sizes and what they want. And Netflix said, you know what? Fuck that. Actually, what people want is a great customer experience where it's curated for them. They don't have to decide. There's 250 channels. You can't possibly surf all of that. Let's just provide people with what they want when they want it, and start to understand their patterns. And it's been a rip-roaring success. Uber understood that actually the biggest problem with a cab is not how much it costs. It's whether the damn thing's going to arrive or not when you've booked it. Well, the killer app on Uber is nothing more than a mapping technology. So they've understood that there's a different way at this market, and I think that you've got to be able to stand half in and half out of your business and recognize the symbols and signals of change happening, and recognize them early, and be self-conscious and self-aware enough to do that, rather than believing your own bullshit that everything's going to be fine and we'll continue to grow.
What kind of person makes a good leader? You know, you talk about this sort of innovating, and therefore you'd think a creative person would necessarily be important, you know, or to have a good element of creativity to lead a business, or to be sort of top of a food tree and something like that. Is that the case? You know, are creative people more likely to actually change things up?
No. Here's the irony. I used to work at an agency called Publicis. We had a creative director there for a while called David Droga. I don't know if you know, heard of Droga 5. Dave is an Australian creative, lives in New York now. Great guy, and he said, Andy, creative people are driven by two things: ego and insecurity. And it's kind of true, right? We want to be loved, and we wonder if the next program, the next thing that we invent, is going to be the death of us. And so it creates in creative people an inherent conservatism, because you're worried about, on the one hand, being loved, and on the other hand, failure. And that's, in a sense, what drives you to be a creative person in the first place. But it prevents you from thinking about yourself in an expansionist kind of way, in a growing sort of way. So I've found, certainly working for 25 years in creative businesses, that it's the creative people who are the last ones to change, because they're so quite resistant to it. I think the most important leadership quality is a sense of self-awareness. Self-awareness to understand what you're good at and what you're not. Self-awareness to understand that life is something where you're continuously learning. I've just turned 49 years old, and I'm not done yet. You know, I'm still learning, I'm still trying, I'm still failing, I'm still falling over. Just because you're a grown-up with kids and a house doesn't mean you're done. So I think the best leaders understand and are aware enough to know that they still have stuff to learn. So there's a healthy sense of incompleteness to leaders. The opposite of what you think, right? That CEOs of big companies are these confident, self-assured sort of individuals who've got it all sussed. In fact, most of the leaders I've met who are really good leaders are the ones who question themselves, are the ones who wonder what's next and doubt their own abilities, but then surround themselves with people who they think can help them.
But inevitably, in the industry, and it's just what I write about a lot and what we cover, and you've been in this for 25 years or more and sort of seen a lot of it. Creative people do rise to the top of agencies, they rise to the top of companies as well, and that's sort of inevitable. So what is it, is there sort of a way of learning some of these other behaviours then, and what sort of resources can they use to actually do that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, again, I kind of go back to the self-awareness thing. No one's born a leader. There are people who have leadership qualities and all the rest of it, but no one's really born a leader. It's something that you have to learn, and you have to get help. I've had a lot of coaching, and one of my coaches is here, Michelle, who helped me through a recent transition out of Telstra. Very difficult. You have to be on this journey to learn. So you have to learn what it's like to be vulnerable, because when you're leading large groups of people, a lot of those people you're never going to meet. They don't know you, but if they're supposed to follow you because you're in charge, then they have to have some sense of belief in who you are, and they can only do that if you expose some of yourself to them. And I think that's one of the biggest, most recent lessons that I've learned is about leadership vulnerability. And I know it's sort of a trendy term, right? Sometimes, and Telstra used to talk about it ad nauseum, and it drove me mad. It's like, I'm not fucking vulnerable, I'm all right. But actually, you need to be real. You need to, I was taught that, our leaders were better than us. Our leaders were somehow more important, more complete individuals than we are. But the truth is, they're more fucked up than most people. But they just hide it well. And more recent teaching is around the need to be you. You're complete and slightly broken self is actually much more attractive to people than some polished version of yourself. And especially if you want to have people follow you, which is fundamentally what leadership is about, right? Is we're going over there, are you coming with us? So I think that being vulnerable and being yourself and being incomplete is really important. I think understanding that you need help from people around you to be better and to learn to be a leader is not some natural gift that we're bestowed with, and some of us have it and some of us don't. It can be taught. And then also, and it sounds really dull this bit, but there's a process at play here too, because you need to be able to communicate your vision to people. You need to be able to have and articulate a vision to people that they want to come with you for. And you need a process by which to cascade that through an organisation, especially if you're in charge of hundreds or thousands of people. You need a mechanism by which to reach all of those people in a powerful way. So I think a lot of leadership is learned and is taught rather than some innate gift that you're bestowed with at birth.
And that's sort of interesting. I guess maybe let's go down the agency path a little bit more. I mean, it's talked about a lot that, agency models are fairly broken at the moment. And a lot of people come out and say, oh, we've got the new generation. I think McDonald's in the US this week last week, Omnicom put together a bespoke agency for them. It's the agency model of the future. And, a lot's been written about it, but it doesn't look like it's necessarily any different from everything people have been doing before. It's just packaging up all the services that McDonald's now need into one place and saying, here you go, that's the agency of the future. It's just the same people doing under a slightly different name. Is there anyone you think who is genuinely innovating in that space and actually pushing that boundary?
I think there are glimpses of it. There's a company called Anomaly in the States that are doing a little bit of pay for performance. That seems to be the model, rather than charging for your time, which is essentially what most agencies do, is a version of charging for your time. Even if it's added up and called a project fee, it actually looks a lot like people's time plus a margin, plus an overhead. And look, I've negotiated those fees for global clients as well as local businesses, and I've been on the receiving end of those negotiations as well. There's not much really that in the core agency holding companies has actually changed. There's a little bit of bonus structure and those sorts of things, but nothing's fundamentally changed. Interestingly though, if you look into the area of management consultancy, you see a lot of change, a lot of different kinds of business models. A lot of the larger consultancies are not charging fees anymore, they're charging a success fee. So I was witness to a recent one, a very large one, which was had identified savings within an organisation to the tune of X million dollars, and their fee was a percentage of the savings. A friend of mine is an investment banker. Their model is to take a proportion of the upside of the value that they create in raising capital or increasing the value of the organisation through a merger or an acquisition. So if we look outside of the immediate marketing and communications field, there's lots of innovation in the business model. If we look inside the agency group business model, there's very little change.
almost seems slightly in conflict actually to do that when you talk about management needing to be sort of humble and have doubts about yourself. It seems to me like you have to be pretty ballsy to say, right, we're going to get rid of fees and we're just going to go on the value that we create for you, or we want a percentage of your profit or something like that. And that's something that must surely be hard to do for the sort of smaller agency types out there compared to a WPP, which can suck up millions of dollars of losses and not really worry about it.
Actually, Alex, I think it's the opposite. Right, so let's picture yourself. You run a big agency group, global CEO of that agency group. You've got 10,000 people. They all have to be fed, so they need to be earning money. The idea of unclipping that business model of fees and retainers and the known negotiation around that is very, very difficult to do. To say, actually, what we'll do is we'll take a performance fee on the upside of the sales that we generate for all of our clients, and we'll take 10% of that. Now, the upside might be way more than you would earn in fees today, but the idea of risking the whole farm against that is just very, very unlikely. And so what happens is what we see today, which is a spiraling down of fees, overheads, margin, slowly shrinking down, and we blame our clients' procurement departments for that, but it's not their fault. It's an oversupplied market, one that's not willing to change and break their existing business model that I would argue is already over the top of the curve.
Let's talk about breaking the model then. You've realised you're at that inflection point, or you're reaching it. Let's say if, hypothetically, you've got 20 people working for you and you think, shit, this isn't going to work anymore. How do you go about actually changing that? Do you need an idea? You need to come up with a new idea, obviously. And how do you go about then managing that change within your company and working out who you want to keep? And is it based on skill set, or is it based on personality types?
Yeah, so I don't think there's one pure answer to this. I think every situation is slightly different. But look, I think there's a couple of conditions that change happens under. The first is that this idea of a burning platform. So you're familiar with the analogy of burning platforms, right? The burning platform was about burn the platform that you're on. There was a floating wooden thing, if you like. Burn that so that you're forced to move to the next platform. That's the origins of the concept of a burning platform. You've got to, as the leader in an organization, you've got to create a burning platform. Because if you don't burn that platform, people will stay on it, right? And no change will happen. And if you've recognized that change does need to happen, then you almost have to burn your platform yourself, or you have to create a sense of burning platform. So I was at Telstra when the burning platform, post what was commonly known as the Three Amigos, left the business and David Thodey arrived as the new CEO. The burning platform was that Telstra had lost its customer base. It had lost relationships with the government, it's lost its business franchise, and it's lost its consumer franchise. And David just drew the analogy after, I think, 3 successive profit warnings, that if we don't do something about this, we won't have a business because we won't have any customers. You can answer that. I'm still a shareholder. So you've got to be able to be prepared to create that burning platform. And what David did was said, everything that we do from now on has to be navigated by the customer. If it's not the right thing to do by the customer, we're not doing it. Every single decision, every pricing decision, every service decision, every investment decision. Tough calls, really tough calls to make, because it's relatively easier to put your prices up, especially when you're in a position of power. So to make those sorts of calls that were in favour of the customers but not necessarily in favour of the business were very unpopular at the time. But unless the leadership was prepared to do that, then there wouldn't be any change in the organisation. So the burning platform was, our customer base is shrinking and we're going to lose them. So I think the first precondition for any change is that you have to create a burning platform. So what is it about your business that if you don't do, will destroy it? What is it that's in your market that inherently is going to completely disrupt your market if you don't do something about it, if you don't head towards it? So you have to, first and foremost, create a burning platform and communicate that to the population of your organization so that they understand the consequences of not doing anything. And I think that's the biggest thing, and it's where most companies go wrong, because most people are apathetic, right? And they don't like change, and so they say, actually, we had a good month last month, it'll be all right. We won a couple of bits of business, everything's fine. These clients really like us. These guys hate us, but we didn't like them anyway. So we convince ourselves that everything's all right. And the job of leadership is to be brave enough to say, no, it isn't. And here's why. And here are the consequences of our actions. And you need some data to support that generally. It can't just be your opinion. So I think that's the first precondition. The second is to create symbols of change. People don't like change. The behavioral economics, I don't know if any of you have studied behavioral economics, but what it suggests is that take fitness for example, nobody wakes up one morning and says, right, that's it, I'm changing my attitude about what I eat, what I drink, and how active I am as a human being. I'm going to be fit from now on. We don't do that. We do one thing at a time. Well, maybe we do that on the 1st of January, right? After we've eaten too much turkey and drank too much and gone to the beach and go, oof, can't see my feet anymore. But aside from that, which is usually then finishes by the 29th of January and we're not going to the gym anymore, nobody changes their attitudes first, they change their behavior. And we nudge our behavior, or our behavior is nudged for us. The reason why Fitbit is so successful and all of these wearables are so successful is because they're nudging us to do one thing. Take 10,000 steps, walk up the stairs, just change one thing at a time. Because we don't like change, we can't make change, we don't change our attitudes, we change our behaviors. So I think the second kind of precondition or strategy is to begin to look for the incremental changes you can make that add up to a fundamental change. And make sure that you have enough of those incremental changes that they don't just become incremental and stay there, that they add up to something that's dramatic. So I think the strategy setting around understanding how people change, those are a number of small changes that will eventually add up to a big change. Because no one's just leaping off the chasm and saying, right, let's tear up our business model and start something new. Just not practical.
We talked a bit about sort of leadership and so on, and being a leader within a business, and want to go into that a little bit more. And probably an appropriate setting to talk about personal brand and personal values. And is it important, as a leader, to actually have sort of a set of principles that you work towards and a brand and a way that you portray yourself to the business and to the market?
I don't know. What do you think? Yes, of course. It isn't. I mean, you have to be consistent, right? People have to understand if they're going to follow you, or if you're going to lead an organisation, you have to be somewhat predictable in the sense that you have to be coherent to them. They have to be able to understand who you are and why you do what you do, and so that can be a shortcut to the staff in an organisation making the right decisions, because this is the value system that is important around here. I'm a huge believer in values-driven organisations. There's that expression that culture eats strategy for breakfast in a business. You can get the culture right, which is modelled by the leadership of the company. So if you're running a company, your behaviour every day, the things that you do, the things that you think, the way that you behave, what you think is important, is exponentially important to your staff, because they want to stick around. They want to be part of this organisation, and therefore if you're not clear about what's important to you and what's important to this organisation and how things get done around here, then they're not going to be clear, and then you start to get confusion. So you've got to have a set of values that you live by. You have to be consistent in your delivery of them. You have to communicate them too, to the people in your company, and be unwavering in them. And there's a great expression that I love, which is that a value is not a value until it costs you something. So if you say, we're all about a sense of ownership, our employees are co-owners in our business, then you better give them shares, or you better give them a profit share. Otherwise, it's just bullshit, right? It has to cost you something. You say we're all about integrity. Well, then don't work for tobacco companies. I had that very instance at the Leading Edge, a business that I ran, and we sat around as a leadership team and said, we've got this really profitable client called Imperial Tobacco, but none of us want to do this. So we resigned it, and it felt good. I mean, cut our arm off, right, because there's a lot of revenue, but it was the right thing to do, and I think you've got to be able to have values that cost you something, otherwise they're not real values. So I think values are really important. Then you have to be absolutely clear about who you are and what you stand for and what's meaningful, and what your expectations are of people. And where I've fallen over most often is because I wasn't clear about what do I expect of myself and what do I expect of you in that contract between us of how we work. It would be wrong for me if I wasn't clear to then chastise you for not doing what I thought you would do.